Hey, welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. I'm Noel, I'm your host. It's a Tuesday morning in London, just about sunrise. In fact, 9:17 in the morning. So when this is going out on a Wednesday evening, it'll be pitch black if you're in the UK. Just to remind you, it's a pre-record, so don't call me at that time because I'll be out doing something, particularly this time of year. I'll probably be doing something like buying presents. But do send me messages, 07506 319 745. I've got my favourite charity in the whole world with me again. I was just absolutely over the moon when I found Christmas at CAMHS. CAMHS is Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. For those that don't know all these spaghetti terms, spaghetti alphabet, it's like it's the first thing you do when you go into the sort of mainstream mental health service is you get strings of letters rather than actual words. And you need like one of those old, if you remember the word press, you used to get that sort of list of things, Control Alt Delete. It's that sort of really strange world. But CAMHS means Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, and Christmas at CAMHS is a charity that was set up to recognise that Christmas needs to be a special time for all children. And for our children in psych wards, especially, and somehow they've been forgotten. Sort of while we're giving loads of presents to other kids, we'd again forgotten about the kids in psych wards over Christmas, and that's what they do. They make sure everybody has a present, and are reminded that it is Christmas and the season of goodwill. And so, of course, I was totally bowled over when I met them, and I've got a couple of people now from Christmas camps who are going to tell us who they are in a sec, and sort of talk about what they do in their own personal experience. So. Who wants to introduce themselves first? I'll let you two fight over it. Go on, have a scrap.
I'm happy to. So, hi, my name's Yvette Castor. I'm a trustee for Christmas for CAMHS. I'm also a journalist and podcaster. I've
Great.
also got, yeah, and I've got a personal interest in the topic around mental health because I've got bipolar disorder and binge eating disorder.
Yeah. And you were in a CAMHS hospital ward, weren't you, when you were younger?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I went into a CAMHS ward when I was 17 after having a manic episode.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that. Welcome. Charlie.
Yeah, I'm Charlie. I am not like directly technically affiliated with the charity yet. But I've been donating for years and this year got a lot more involved, which is really lovely. So that's exciting. But I'm a writer, speaker, creator, have spent quite a long time working within like psychiatric system change for CAMHS, specifically around autism and human rights. And yeah, I was admitted at 15 in December, so spent the entire kind of Christmas period in a unit that year. And yeah, I'm autistic amongst other things, which is kind of a part of my like story in terms of CAMS and it's obviously so common. So
Yeah. Great. Thank you. It may not be obvious to other people, Charlie. So when we start to talk about things, I'm going to be, like a judge in court will ask stupid questions so that they inform the jury.
yeah,
I that sort of
sure.
role. And so it's not obvious why somebody with who's got neurodiversity would necessarily be in a psych ward. It is to me and you. Tell us why people with neurodiversity are. Is it something to do with your condition? I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, so neurodiversity refers to like all groups of people. So neurodivergent people, also like so a lot like most people in a psychiatric ward could be called neurodivergent because it kind of goes beyond autism and ADHD, and includes kind of things like personality disorder, eating disorder, etc., PTSD. But in terms of autistic people in CAMS wards, we are anecdotally, the evidence says around 60%, which to me is like staggering. It's a huge, huge number to be admitted. And I think the reason I think kind of shifts about, I think it's different for different people. For me, it was essentially that my body and brain became unable to cope with the fact that I was masking so much.
Mm.
Like we kind of say now that it was basically like I completely burnt out in terms of masking. Like I just I wasn't identified or diagnosed. I had no idea. I just thought I was like very weird, very broken, and there was so much pressure on me at the time that I just couldn't do it anymore. So that's kind of like how it, I think it goes for a lot of people, is a lot of young people, is that they just physically can't cope under the system anymore. Like the absolute burden of living in a neurotypical society just becomes too much. I think for others, it can be about there being a complete lack of other care available. So for me, the doctors that assessed me to be admitted had never met me before.
Mm.
And they basically said, you and your family need some time and space away from each other. And you would hope that there would be other ways of doing that, like respite or supported living or whatever. But there just isn't that availability. So instead, like a psych ward was just the place I ended up.
Right.
Um, so I think we see a lot of that as well. And then there's also just like the way that we communicate is different, the way that we understand the world is different. And when you talk to a mental health professional, I think sometimes the way that we are experiencing the world or experiencing our own internal experiences is kind of very misunderstood and kind of leaves us in that position. But the average admission time for an autistic person is 4.8 years. It's slightly down from the 5.5 that it was.
My jaw has just dropped the floor again. It's unreal that.
Yeah, like, my admission did me a huge amount of damage, but 3 months compared to nearly 5 years is, almost getting off lightly. So it's, I can't even imagine processing like that, like for that long. So yeah, I think there's a few reasons, but that's kind of some of the ways that we
I
see
need to
it.
breathe through that. I mean, it's not because people who work on these wards are bad or anything like that. It's just they're inherently unhealthy places and they should only be used briefly to stabilize people. But that's quite shocking. You don't know this about me, but my background is moving people out of institutional care into community settings back in the 90s when we were first closing down all those big bins. I worked a lot with neurodiverse people and people with learning disabilities at that point who'd spent their lives in institutional care, to be honest, in large hospitals. And it's a deep sadness personally to see that we've effectively gone back to that with some groups of people, that we've
Yeah,
just life is in an institution because we won't invest in community structures that support them.
yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about this in terms of like, have we actually really taken away that format? Like, not really. And I think it's just, if you haven't touched the psychiatric system, you're not going to be that aware of it. Like, if it's not something that your family has really been through, you don't even really realize that it like carries on, that it like really
Yeah,
exists. Like, we know when I was admitted, I don't think I even knew that kids could go into a psych ward. Like, it just wasn't something I was aware of.
yeah.
So I think it's very like
And was yours a
easy.
Mental Health Act entry?
No, so I was officially informal, but it was kind of always pretty clear that if I'd actually tried to leave, that like I wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah. So
Like
again, just so I asked a dumb question, Mental Health Act is actually you probably would have been admitted via the Mental Health Act, but Section 2 rather than 3.
yeah,
That's right.
probably.
So just for the information of people out there, people talk about this word sectioned, don't they? Generally, what they mean by that is Section 3 of the Mental Health Act 1986, which is a compulsion to accept treatment after an assessment if people are resistant to treatment. So literally what you say, Charlie, if you comply with treatment, you'll remain on Section 2. But if at the first hint that you refuse treatment, you'll be placed on Section 3. And then literally all your rights are removed. Charlie, you okay? I was talking about this. I want to
Yeah, no, it's fine.
check on your feelings about that you're okay
Yeah,
with this and it's not
yeah.
bringing up too many unpleasant memories and intrusive thoughts. Again, I'm saying that because if you're listening to this and you've had uncomfortable experiences of the Mental Health Act system, and you're having intrusive thoughts and feelings, and you haven't had the help to process that sort of experience, it's okay. You're not alone. You're really not. And it's not weird that you're having these reactions. And make sure you talk to somebody about them that you trust. And don't act out on your thoughts and feelings, particularly if they tell you to hurt yourself. Okay, folks? So reach out, talk to people. Maybe stop watching this show for a bit, have a chat with people, and then come back to it. Give yourself a break. All right. So, I mean, I have to say that I'm sort of, my head's just exploded at the idea of people being in a psych ward for 4.5 years. That's not the way to live life. It really isn't. And I happen to know the figures. They have increased exponentially for people with autism in terms of admissions, and under the Mental Health Act Section 3 with compulsion attached to it. And my current practice is working with social services to provide services for kids in the community to prevent hospitalisation. So I'm absolutely directly involved, and one of my kids is autistic and learning disabled, and we're managing to keep him out of hospital, and I'm very glad about that. So absolutely nobody wants children to end up in hospital, because even mental health act practitioners will tell you that they don't want children in hospital, because you need to remain with services out in the community. Yvette, your experience, tell us about sort of how you got involved. You have a classically what would be defined as a psychiatric condition. Right, so people wouldn't really think of autism and neurodiversity as psychiatric conditions, but bipolar and these types of disorders, people sort of know. So tell us about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm a fairly classic case, really. My mum had bipolar disorder, and so when I started getting depressed at 14, I guess I was lucky because we were a very close family, so she saw the signs and she got me straight to the GP. And at 14, the advice was, do more exercise, go on walks. I didn't go on meds at that point.
Yeah.
And it was a sort of see how things go type thing. But yeah, thinking about it, I'm lucky that I have, a parent caregiver who has had her experiences, because I guess she was on the lookout for it for a while, because as I'm sure you know, bipolar disorder quite often runs in families. Not always. You can't say you definitely get it if a parent has it, but there is more chance. So I started getting depressed at 14, and then when I was 17, I had a manic episode.
Yeah.
And that was really strange. I try and just sort of describe it briefly for people who haven't had a manic episode.
Yes, please do. Yes.
Yeah. So basically, it was almost like 1 minute I was kind of living a fairly normal teenage life, going to sixth form, having friends. And then one evening, I'd had a breakup with a boy. I got very emotional. I listened to a lot of very loud music. I sort of turned it right up. And from that kind of emotional stress, and I was also under a lot of stress in terms of my A levels in terms of work. So I guess I had like pressure on myself there. From that, I then ended up losing touch with reality. So I ended up having delusions. I basically believed that I could breathe underwater. I thought that I could do magical spells. I thought that I controlled the weather. It was quite shocking for my parents, even though my mum was kind of on the lookout for things like this, because from their point of view, like they'd gone out to a concert, and when they left me, I was fine or sane-ish. And when they came back, I was basically very unwell. And I remember even through the manic episodes, my sister asking me, if I'd taken drugs, basically, because I think for people who haven't experienced a manic episode, that might be a sort of, I don't know. Sorry, I'm not sure how much you talk about things like drugs on this show, but
absolutely talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Okay.
triggering subjects come up, I'll do what I did, which is just stop us and say this is a triggering subject. But this is
Okay.
for general consumption. We're not controlled by language. We're not controlled by topic or anything like that. But I do sort of give people warnings, and because it's not live, because it is a show, people can just stop it and they have a choice. Yeah. So feel free to discuss whatever you need to discuss, Yvette.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for people who haven't had a manic episode, but a lot of people when they're younger, they might have tried certain drugs where they lose touch with reality or have hallucinations or delusions, possibly. That can be a good way for me to kind of help to describe to them what a manic episode is like for me. But of course, the crucial difference is that if you've chosen to do drugs, unless you have an addiction problem, but if you're sort of doing them recreationally, you've chosen to take that drug and then have that experience. Whereas with the manic episode, I didn't have a choice in going from that headspace from being air quotes normal to losing touch with reality and having no control over my thinking. And it was a very sort of like rapid state. So I'd get sort of racing thoughts. I wasn't sleeping. I did a lot of writing, wrote a lot of nonsense, and that manic state continued, I think, for several weeks. And during that time, my parents cared for me. There was no question that I'd go to sixth form at that time because, I didn't even remember that sixth form existed. I was convinced that, like I said, I had all these magical powers and that I needed to be doing these things involving spells. And then when the manic episode ended, I just felt like my whole world had completely shattered. Until then, I felt like even though I'd had depression, until that point, I felt like I was a relatively, again, air quotes, normal teenager. But after the manic episode, I really felt like I'd also lost my identity. I didn't know who I was. During that time, there wasn't as much discussion and information around mental illness. So I felt very isolated. I didn't feel like it was something I could talk to friends about. So actually, like, I went from having some very close friendships to, I just didn't tell them anything about what had happened. And I guess a combination of the isolation that I felt, but also just the way that moods go in terms of bipolar disorder. I went from having that manic episode, coming back to sort of a more balanced state, but then feeling so bad about what had happened, then I then became suicidally depressed, tried to kill myself, and then I was very lucky in that a nurse from a young person's mental health unit was at that time able to come out and see me, talk to me, and I managed to sort of give her a rough idea of what happened. Nothing like how I've just managed to describe it to you.
Yeah, you would have been very confused, depressed, and sort of really shaken.
Yeah, I was in a really bad way, and I certainly had no understanding of manic episodes. I felt really bad, and I told her that I'd tried to kill myself and I planned to do it again. And at that point, I was admitted to a CAMHS unit as a day patient.
Yeah. And then did they prescribe meds and stuff like that? Is that part of your journey?
No, not at that point. So when I went to the unit, it was going as a day patient, and so being involved in individual and also group therapy.
Right.
They did discuss with me at one point whether I wanted to go on meds. And I guess I still don't really know if that would have been right for me at that time. Because so fast forward to when I had a few more manic episodes and then depressive episodes, and then I went on meds at 24.
Yeah.
But when I was sort of a teenager, I also had a lot of fear around medication. I was very worried that it might change who I was as a person.
Yeah.
I don't feel like that now at all. I really feel like my mood stabilizers have helped so much. But at that time, I just had a lot of fear around it. And I'd also...
If I ask, you want atypicals or the old lithium? You don't have to answer.
So I'm on one called Depakote now.
Right.
Yeah. But at the time, they didn't suggest particular ones. I don't remember particular ones they were kind of suggesting. But I do remember having a conversation with a friend that I'd made at the CAMHS unit who was in there for depression. And unfortunately, or I don't know if it's fortunately or unfortunately, but for whatever reason, we had a really in-depth conversation. And she told me about a lot of the side effects. And to be honest, that was another reason why I decided not to at that point. But I mean, I think people have to come to these things in their own time.
Yeah. I mean, we just want to stop and pause and check in with ourselves and make sure we're okay. I know I'm upset still about the idea of people being in a psych ward for 4.5 years. In fact, I'm furious. Sort of like because of a lack of care services rather than anything else. And I just want to check how you are both feeling about the story so far, and want to thank you for your generosity and your courage in sharing those stories, because they are difficult. And I want to bring up another point after that. So let's just do a quick round robin to check we're okay, we're feeling grounded, and we feel safe.
Yeah, I'm good.
Good. Thanks, Charli. Yvette?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks.
And
Thanks for
I
talking to me.
want that as a modeling for people listening. I want you to check in with yourself and be kind to yourself while you're listening, and check in with your own reactions and take your time. So one thing you said was, which I think is an interesting question for our times, Yvette, and I want to ask both of you what you think about this, is you said at that point people weren't talking about mental health issues. And so I was really isolated and lonely. That's not the word you use, but that sort of stigma, lack of conversation. Now, these days we are having more of a conversation, right? And certain media pundits who look a bit like me, middle-aged blokes who are angry, I'm not angry, hopefully, sort of go on, kids these days are all snowflakes and hang on, let me lift my knuckles off the floor. So tell me what you think about the fact that we are a bit more open. I wouldn't say we're hugely open, to be honest. But what's the impact of making it permissible to have conversations about these issues as opposed to ignoring them and not talking about them? What's the sort of, in your experience, what's the value of opening up these conversations or not?
I mean, from my point of view, it's hugely helpful in terms of, because I was a teenager in the 90s, I'm a bit older than Charli. So for me at that time, really, it was only Stephen Fry, I believe, who was kind of writing about it.
Yeah.
Maybe also Ruby Wax at that point, although I'm not sure. She does such fantastic stuff now, but I think at that point it was mainly Stephen Fry who was like the one talking.
Just before Mike Milligan, who was also diagnosed with bipolar. So he'd sort of done some autobiographical work, but it was very hidden. It was really wasn't talked about very much. Yeah.
Exactly. I think I remember one program that Stephen Fry had done, and also some writing, and that was kind of like a beacon. But then since then, it has changed a lot. And in terms of what you were saying around people sort of saying, oh, almost it's talked about too much, or all these, young people complaining about mental health and stuff. I mean, I think it's really important that people do understand mental health a lot more.
Yeah.
And I actually think that a lot of people still don't really understand mental health. I mean, I was having a chat to a friend about this recently, and everyone knows the 1 in 4 thing. So 1 in 4 people struggle with mental health, but then also you have to think about the 3 in 4 people who don't. So they really don't understand it. And part of my work in terms of journalism, hopefully, has been trying to explain to people what conditions are, how they can affect people, how it can affect their families, and just generally trying to help people understand. And it does make me quite angry, even though I work in media. Sometimes I'll be listening to a radio show and they'll be sort of saying about, I get the impression that some people who don't really have experience of mental illness, or they don't have experience of their families someone in their family being affected by mental illness, I get the impression still, unfortunately, that some people think that it's maybe an excuse, or they think that anxiety is just being a bit worried. But obviously, in my field, with all the work I've done and the interviews I've done, anxiety is, such a debilitating condition, in terms of panic attacks, how it could stop you. I mean, depending on your personal condition, but how it could stop you leaving the house, how it can stop you living your life. So I think if you don't really understand that, you just hear the word anxiety and you think, oh, they're just a bit anxious. You know, they're anxious how I'm anxious. You know, but I think that's because they're part of the 3 and 4 who don't really have experienced it or they haven't seen it. And the same with depression. You know, I think some people think, oh, depression's just feeling a bit sad, pull yourself together. But from someone like me, you know, that's almost laughable, because depression during my sort of most depressed periods, that's involved, you know, not being able to get out of bed, not being able to shower, you know, losing work because I'm just physically not able to look at my phone, at just being so overwhelmed by not necessarily sadness, just complete sort of emptiness, no energy, and suicidal impulses.
Hmm.
So to me, that's, although you try to explain to people that the sadness is kind of part of it, but it's still a challenge. I don't know what you think, Charli, around this.
Yeah, Charli, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously for me, I come at this more from the autism and ADHD angle, and I think it's a really tough time to talk about being autistic and ADHD. The media is pumping out articles almost every day saying everyone is suddenly autistic and ADHD. People are trying to get a diagnosis so they can get on benefits and all of this stuff that is just coming out like daily, and it's impossible to push back on because it's coming out in such droves. We're really lucky to be in a time where, when I was diagnosed autistic 9 years ago, there was like no information. The first time that it was brought up to me, it's not something we had ever considered. I didn't know. I'd like I'd met two autistic boys when I was younger, but they were nothing like me. It wasn't something that was on the table.
Mhm.
And then suddenly it was on the table, and there were like two books and a handful of websites. Like there was just nothing there. So we live in this time where there is so much more information about it. But unfortunately, that's being used against us instead of, being seen as something positive. And I think it's really hard to, yeah, it's really impossible to feel comfortable in a society that wholeheartedly believes that you're scrounging or that you're making it up for clout or attention. It's so difficult. Like it's even more difficult for those who don't get a formal diagnosis. But there was a tweet the other day somebody sent out, and their NHS trust had sent them an email saying, if you were referred, but in the last like 3 months, then we won't assess you till 2048.
Yeah.
And it's completely unfathomable that that's like seen as fine. Like that's completely okay and normal and not something that we should be worried about.
Yeah.
So I think it's fascinating. We have this increase in information and in this awareness, and that's brilliant, but it's actually caused this like onslaught of ableism towards us that is really, really hard to combat.
Why do you think, Charli? I mean, I think it is that people have certainly picked up on the sort of autism, not so much autism, but definitely the ADHD. Without a doubt, that's become weaponized in the media quite clearly. And have you any thoughts about why these issues in particular, and sort of what they represent for people and why they would want to attack it?
I think there's a few tracks. I think one is that people hate the concept of disability,
Yeah.
because they wholeheartedly engage in capitalism and in the belief that everyone should be able to work and everyone should be able to just get out of bed and go to work and work a 9 to 5, and you shouldn't be relying on the system. You shouldn't be claiming any money that you're entitled to. You shouldn't need any adjustments. When you get more empowered disabled and neurodivergent people, we are asking for something that the system doesn't want to provide. So there's that. I think there's also yeah, I think people just hate anything that's not like themselves. Like it's this thing of, well, I can do it, so why can't you? And I think people are very, I don't know how to put it, but I think people are very resistant to self-autonomy
Yeah.
and self-advocacy. I think, there's this thing of, well, you've just learnt about it on TikTok and suddenly decided that's what you are. When for most of us, like that might be a facet of it, like it may be that it is something we've come across online and then learnt about ourselves. So for me, I was diagnosed autistic in the unit at 15. I picked my ADHD up 5 years later. It was never on the table. It wasn't something anyone had ever thought about. I was telling doctors for years that like I was having five different thoughts at once and two different songs would be playing, and everyone was like, it's autism associated anxiety.
Hmm.
And at the time I was really anxious, so fair
But
enough.
for a long time, and
Um,
it was also for a long time thought that the two
yeah,
diagnoses,
you couldn't be diagnosed with both
but now
until
you can
fairly
be.
recently.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you couldn't be diagnosed with both for a long time. So, yeah. But like, yeah, it was never on the table. Like, I was talking about internal hyperactivity, racing thoughts, impulsivity all the time, but
Yeah.
it just wasn't on the table. So I picked that up myself, and TikTok was a part of that. I did start to learn about some of this stuff, but it wasn't that I just went, okay, then I must have ADHD and that's cool. Like, you end up doing mass amounts of research to learn about yourself in a society that doesn't want you to. Um, and yeah, I think people get very edgy about people who are willing to be different and to learn about themselves because you're going against the status quo in a way that people are deeply uncomfortable with.
It's interesting, isn't it? Do you know the saying, people don't fake having depression, they fake being well?
Yeah. I think it's exactly the same for autism, for ADHD around, traits like executive functioning difference,
Yeah.
sensory difference, all of that. I think it is, yeah, it's the same thing. I masked so hard, completely unknowingly, for 15 years before my body and my brain just cut out, like it just couldn't do it. And so many people are doing that and now learning at 20, at 30, at 40. So yeah, it's a really similar thing, I think.
Charlie, do you aspire to be sponging on the state for the rest of your life? Is that your vision of yourself?
Well, no, like, it
Right.
is it is it is a system that I have to engage in. But I don't think anyone, it's like people talk about disabled benefit fraud and they talk
Like
about it as if it's this massive problem. And actually the statistic is like, I think it's 0.03% of all benefit fraud. Don't quote me on that. That could be, but it's definitely less than
the whole
1%.
definition of benefit fraud is
Yeah,
nonsense. The amount of unclaimed benefits dwarfs and has always dwarfed,
yeah, exactly.
always dwarfed
I'm
because
so glad you brought that up.
yeah,
Yeah, because
it's
I
just
was thinking that as well.
yeah,
The number of, from my point of view, like the number of people with long-term mental illnesses
yeah.
who just aren't able to apply for the benefits that they'd be, completely deserving of, like that entitled to,
Yeah.
is just huge. And so, yeah, it makes me very angry when you hear about this sort of idea that people are scrounging or making things up. Because, yeah, there's so many people of all ages, but especially people with long-term mental illnesses who can't access the benefits that they're entitled to. I mean, if you look at just the hoops you have to jump through at the moment to get something like PIP, it's ridiculous. Like the pages and pages and pages you fill
Yeah.
in. I've looked at that form and I've thought, if I was in suicidal depression, there's absolutely no way I'd be able to fill that in. And then anyway, if I sent it off, it would then be rejected. And I certainly wouldn't have the energy to then go to court and appeal it. And again, if I was in a manic episode, there's no way I'd be able to do any of that. And
It's,
there
I
aren't,
don't even
unfortunately, there
understand
aren't.
what benefit
Sorry, go.
is. The largest section of the benefits bill are payouts to pensioners through money they've earned over the years they put into the pot, and they get their pension, and that's by far the biggest part of the sort of the bill to society, and nobody actually attacks that, and nobody would dare to attack it. So clearly, decisions and choices are being made about who is more vulnerable and who they want to attach a target to. So we can be very clear about that. I'm interested in your experience of being the target, though, and sort of what that's like, what that does to you. Sort of in Yvette, you've been longer advocating and being sort of an advocate for being open about these things, and Charli maybe not so long, but still there. What's it like being that target? What do you experience when you have this morning bringing on some idiot who doesn't know what they're talking about, just sort of spewing a load of nonsense?
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes me very angry, but it doesn't surprise me because you do hear it so often still. So, I mean, yeah, it makes me angry, but then I think you can use that anger to create content, whether it's, online or writing an article that you can then hopefully explain to people. And I think you can fuel your anger into positive channels.
Right.
So that's what I would say.
Charli, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I think, it it does feel like kicking against a tide that like it's impossible. Like, you like for me, I remember last year there was like a week and I was like creating a post about one article that had come out, and then I posted that, and then the next day there was a new one. And it just does feel so never ending. Like it does just feel so continual, and like it's like I know I have a voice against it. I know that, but like the people who really need to hear it are never going to be the ones that hear it.
They're
And
going to listen to you, Charli, I promise you.
well, yeah, but I think, like a lot of the time they a lot of platforms don't platform
Yeah.
both sides. So it does feel like it's impossible when someone's being constantly platformed to talk about something they don't have any lived experience of.
Yes.
And then to sit here and kind of go, but I know like I know all the statistics. I know my own experience. I know so much more than this person, but like they only want to look one way. So I
Yeah.
do find it really, really hard. But I think that's like I'm really having to learn to engage in other ways. So
Right.
things like working, like supporting charity and stuff is really helping me to kind of feel more in control of that, I think.
Yeah, good. Rather than on your own fighting upstream, as it were.
Yeah.
And the risk is just getting swept away. Yeah, I remember that sort of from my 20s as well. And I've always had a diagnosis all my life. So, like, in and out of wellness and illness, and it's all a continuum, all of that sort of stuff. So I've always felt a bit weird. That's largely because I am a bit weird, really. So I'm quite happy with that these days. It's all right. I'll live with it. Um, one of the things I'm interested in is to sort of root through, because there's an issue about institutionalization. Now, we should say at this point, and you've mentioned it, about that CAMHS isn't just inpatient institutional care. It's a range of services, even though they're completely swamped and overwhelmed for a variety of reasons. Um, but the charities focus on those kids who are in a hospital over Christmas. So we're sort of veered towards that type of experience because that's what you deliver to. So in terms of that type of experience and having been both sort of through that system, as it were, what's the route out? Because it can be quite a system that can trap people really, and trap your identity, your sense of self. That Yvette, what you said about that sort of earthquake in your identity after your first episode and stuff is very common experience of not being able to trust your own mind, not being able to trust yourself. Um, Charli, what you said about sort of diagnosis suddenly coming upon them and understanding things, but being at that point quite emotionally disabled because of the coping and survival strategies you've had to put in place, and how exhausting they are and how damaging they are. What's been the route out of that sort of medicalization of your condition into more empowered sort of social and psychological and freedom?
That's a huge question. I'll try and answer it. So from my point of view, in terms of leaving the CAMHS unit when I was a teenager, if I think about it now, I was really lucky that I had some, and I'm not just saying this to be nice, I had some really fantastic CAMHS staff
Yeah.
who were very supportive and quietly supportive, and thinking about it again in terms of the meds thing, suggesting that I could go on meds, but not forcing me to go on meds. I think that's quite incredible. And I don't know if that's the situation now, to be totally honest, but so quietly supportive. And my experience was being, having activity groups there. At the time, I thought it was like, I always say it's a bit like a rubbish youth club, to be honest. So I was kind of kept busy with certain craft things, and some musical activities, which was great for me because I love music, and also being surrounded by other young people who were also going through an incredibly difficult time of their own, struggling with all sorts of issues, so OCD, depression, schizophrenia, all sorts of things. But finding friends among them. So finding that sort of peer support, I guess I'd call it now, but at the time, again, I didn't have a clue what peer support was. But so I guess the combination of peer support from professionals, and then also just time. So just regularly going back to that unit and getting the support. And then, if I'm totally honest, I then just got a bit bored because I was lucky that my mood stabilized more. Yeah. So I'd been from a place where I was suicidally depressed. It came back up again. It stabilized. In terms of my bipolar disorder, I do have the kind, even when I'm not on meds, where I do have fairly long periods of, I don't like using normal, but like a kind of average type of mood. So it came up, so it came up to sort of fairly balanced mood again. Yeah. And then, after sort of a period of time, I got bored. I started to wonder, what was going on at my school again. And again, I had a really supportive school I gradually started going back to school a little bit, but still going to the CAMHS unit some days. And then so basically gradually being reintroduced into school. And I'm really glad that was done gradually as well, because even that first day of going back, I was so scared. I didn't tell any of my friends. I was just didn't know what I was doing at all. So that was my experience then. And in terms of now because again, after that, I then had more manic episodes and depressive episodes, eventually went on mood stabilizers at 24, then found things easier because I wasn't having manic episodes. I still get some depression. But I guess stepping away from the sort of hospitalization sort of thing, or having to go into a hospital. I mean, I don't know, because bipolar disorder is a bit of a strange one, hopefully I'll stay sort of okay for a while, but realistically I might get very bad again at some point, and I might have to go back into a hospital. Yeah. And saying that out loud fills me with dread, but it's it might happen, and I do have to kind of just say, not whatever, because I don't know why I'm laughing, because I don't feel like it's something to laugh about, but maybe it's better to laugh than to cry,
Yes.
But I think what I'm saying is, like, I'll try and do things now which I know help to keep me well. So for me personally, that's taking my mood stabilizers, that's taking regular exercise, that's sort of having a relatively boring diet without too much caffeine and sugar for me personally. That's doing things like meditation, that's keeping in contact with friends, that's singing in a choir, because I find that very helpful for my mental health. So there's all these things that I try and do now to stay mentally well and out of hospital. But realistically, I've got a long-term mental illness. I might have to go back in at some point, and that's all right. I don't want to, but I might. So yeah, I guess that's what I'd say.
I mean, it's almost like you're telling us sort of slightly That's like the ideal options that we want, right? That as a kid, you'll have a well-informed family who understand this stuff, even though they feel emotionally overwhelmed. They understand what's happening. Appropriate services come to you and give you options and choices, and they support you in making decisions, not taking your power away from you necessarily, give you peer support, which is a stepping stone in back to school and normal life. And then you are told that you have options, you get more information, you grow with it. And here we have, an adult who is a fully functioning member of society, right? Uh,
Well, that was
as
what a
much as
lovely
anybody
compliment.
is,
Thank
right?
you.
As much as anybody is, right? And so that's like the idealized story, if you like, and how it can work. And we know it can work, that sort of community-based services that work with kids, support them, give them information, give them attachment objects, give them services they can choose to be part of and leave and come and out of over a period of time, can grow and sort of re-engage with the world. I mean, that's sort of how we want it. Charlie, sort of what's helped you move on, as it were?
Yeah, so for me, like it became clear pretty quickly that the ward was not where I should be.
Yeah.
I wasn't there for traditional reasons. And yeah, it was like very quickly, okay, this is not right. The
I should also
sensory.
say there isn't really any medication for autism.
No, well,
Like,
no, there isn't. I mean, I was very quickly placed on low dose antipsychotic, which is fairly standard treatment for autistics who end up in units. I understand now. That's kind of how where we end up a lot of the time. I
it's a
haven't managed
behavior
to,
control drug in that context.
yeah, and I haven't managed to get off that drug since,
Right.
which is, extremely, extremely difficult because I'm not in the same place that I was, but it's really, really hard to come off. So yeah, that's like an ongoing thing. But I think for me, yeah, very quickly, not the place for me. But was in over Christmas, so everything slows down, everything, it's just stopped essentially. No doctors on the wards, no therapy, no nothing really. Um, and it was like two parts of me because I was being very quickly traumatized
Mhm.
by the sensory environment, by all of the things that I was seeing from other young people, by, being away from my family, my friends, my possessions, etc.
Yeah.
But there was this other part of me that very quickly did become institutionalized because I'm autistic. So routine, structure, things like that, like knowing the staff quite well, that actually was like something that my brain really benefited from in a time when my brain was in such chaos.
Yeah.
So it was like there was these two parts of me. But some would call it good self-advocacy, some would call me gobby. I very quickly was saying to the doctors, like, I want you to let me go back into school for a couple of hours. Like, I was in rehearsals for an amateur show at the time that I wanted to do. Like, I was like, you need to let me out for these things. Otherwise, I'll never go back into society. Like, I physically will not cope. And when they did eventually try and discharge me, I had my care planning approach meeting and they wanted to discharge me the next day without any warning, which obviously for an autistic person, like moving environment to environment is really, really hard. So I was like, you can't do that. Like, you can't force me to be discharged tomorrow. And I ended up getting like another 10 days. But it was so hard to come back into society because I'd had no support to do that. I didn't get on a bus for 2 years
Mm.
after that experience because I physically just couldn't engage with the world. And I think if I hadn't have pushed them to let me do some trial couple of hours in school, I probably never would have gone back
Right.
because there just isn't the support for you to like continue to just be a person. And I already struggle socially so much that being completely withdrawn and then having to like try and re-engage with that is something really, really difficult. But yeah, it's been really difficult. Like I've been left with CPTSD.
Just
And
so that people know, complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah. Um, it's yeah, it's really difficult. And because I ended up working in the system like 4 years later, like at 19, when I was very angry, very traumatized, like very insistent I wanted to change things in ways that were not that realistic.
Mhm.
It's been kind of 4 years of doing that and like pushing and pushing and pushing in ways that are not like I don't see it the same way I saw it 4 years ago. So it's been really interesting to kind of navigate all of that and
Just to say, Yvette's given us a message that she needs to go and get a charger. Go and get your charger, Yvette. It's fine. Often you come back when you're ready. It's fine. As though it's live. So a very different route from Yvette. Yvette was given
Mm,
much more choice and resources and support. And you have a tendency, I think, in your narrative to suggest that that your response to the situation you're in was somehow wrong. It isn't, The idea that you wouldn't be angry about what was happening to you is bonkers, Of course,
yeah.
anybody would be angry and quite justifiable. It's a sort of like that classic Catch-22 film. Do you know, have you read the book or seen the film? Like
Yeah.
it's a rational response to an irrational system, and then that gets pathologized. There's nothing
Yeah.
pathological about that response. It's quite understandable. Um, to what extent do you think the difference in the response of those services was because they're not set up for autism, stroke, ADHD, and to what extent is it because those services just don't exist anymore?
I think that, I was presenting in a way that they just didn't see.
Yeah.
Like just wasn't something that they could fathom. And yeah, there was nowhere else for me to go. Like they're just, so for context, like now we do the care education treatment reviews.
Okay.
So if a young person or person with a learning disability or who's autistic is at risk of admission to hospital, you have a big MDT with an independent panel.
Yeah.
So I spent the last 4 years sitting on said independent panels as an expert by experience. And, so often in those, we kind of sit down and as a panel, we can say hospital is not the right place. Let's do X, Y, Z. Now that doesn't always work because there is such a lack of services. The actions that we recommend don't happen a lot of the time and then hospital happens anyway. But that wasn't a system at the time for me. That came in just kind of after my admission. So there wasn't somebody on the other side going, actually, we should do something else here. I find it unfathomable that two doctors that had never met me could make that decision.
Mm.
I understand that they have to be independent to your actual, like my psychiatrist at the time, but it's wild to me that those two doctors could sit and talk to me for less than an hour and
Yes.
make a decision that has left me so traumatized. Like
Yeah. We've
it's
got another show to do around that, really have. And I want to bring you both back on and discuss these issues. One about the whole Mental Health Act process and how
mm,
medieval it is. You know, it's like putting people on the rack and then saying confess. I mean, of course you're going to confess if you're on the rack, right? That's the way it works. The other is the prevalence of trauma from treatment. Like it's horrific, the numbers involved. But I don't want to get into that right now. I want to bring you back and discuss it because we're coming towards the end of the show. Um, so part of your journey out of it was to have a very understandable reaction, which is called anger, about the injustice that was happening to you, to channel that anger into challenging the system to change and do something different, right? Yeah. And then you channel that into being part of um, uh, changes to services, structural changes to services, these review bodies. Where are you at in that growth now? Because I think it's different for you now. You've been indicating that you're in a different place now.
yeah, I think, I have seen the way that the system functions and been very much within that in a way that I have become less and less comfortable with. You know, I think the concept of co-production is great, but actually is doing a lot of damage to a lot of us and isn't being done very well a lot of the time. You know,
Mhm.
I've been involved in some really great projects and some really terrible ones.
Yeah.
And I've kind of gotten to a point where I am desperately trying to move away from that experience as the only part of me. Um, and so, yeah, it's just, you know, I'm trying to put my energy around this in a different place, which is kind of, you know, why I was wanted to support the charity more directly.
Yes.
Because I know I still have a lot of energy and a lot of interest in the system and being a part of changing it, but I just don't believe that I can do it the way I've been trying to do it. So kind of trying to replace that and give that energy elsewhere has been like a real journey and is something that I'm definitely still working on.
Yeah, I mean, institutions institutionalize,
Yeah.
but their job to sort of, and so being in them, that's what's going to happen. And that's my experience. That's why I believed we'd close them down.
Yeah.
That's why I was part of closing them down, to be honest. So I get that. There's also that thing about, again, one's own growth and development as a human being. And it seems to me, if I would characterize you as an entrepreneur, you may not like that term because it's slightly capitalistic, but actually, you know, I wouldn't want to let the capitalists steal that idea. Entrepreneur or creative. They're similar words for me, to be honest. So you're being an entrepreneur, a creative in the space, and you found that creative way of thinking about what you need to do, and
Mhm.
that advocacy within the system, then you might become outside of the system. What's interesting me about that story, I don't know if you've thought about it in those terms, and why I use the word entrepreneur is I see what you're talking about quite a lot. Not always, there's a lot of tragedy as well, but in terms of people who manage to transform these experiences, um, it's this, well, I'm going to be strong, independent, I'm going to grow, I'm going to help other people, demonstrating exactly the skill set that the sort of angry pieces of gammon demand that people have. Yeah, just not doing it in the way they want, which is
Yeah.
private capital. But it is literally the same skill set. Entrepreneurial, setting up new services, seeing gaps in the market. And these terms may not be comfortable for you, but it is
Mm.
literally the same set of skills.
Yeah, and also it's funny you mentioned the I know who you're talking about when you're sort of talking about gammon, but then they're often the sort of media commentators who don't really understand influencers or content creation, or
Hey,
while that's, or
exactly.
they simply don't understand that being an influencer is a career these days, you know. And as you mentioned, you know, in it's it's just another word for entrepreneur, really. It's having that sort of skill set where you're constantly coming up with new imaginative ideas, and then yeah, producing something which is sometimes you know, sometimes to sell something, or sometimes to raise awareness, or sometimes, you know, in both of our cases, you know, to help promote a brilliant charity and, you know, use that energy to come up with ideas to get the word out about a charity like Christmas for CAMHS.
I mean, it's literally an ideal solution, isn't it? That somebody comes out of what is a broken situation and then works on repairing it. And that repair involves self. You can't
Yeah,
get much more ideal than that in terms of empowerment and advocacy and growth and development, uh, which is the opposite of the sort of dominant patriarchal male white entitled position, right? That's their view is that you're a sponger. You've just demonstrated quite the opposite, and and I'm really grateful for that. I'm aware we're coming towards the end and want to talk about the charity because we haven't. I think you have talked about it because both of you are demonstrating what happens when people find their voices within this type of system. and start to use their brains, their creativity, their skills, network and support each other and come through and start to, which I guess is all part of this sort of movement and this charity. Tell us about specifically, though, the charity, what it does and what your involvement is or is not.
So Christmas for CAMHS is a charity that sends Christmas gifts and decorations and advent calendars to every single CAMHS unit in the UK. And I think from a volunteer or supporter's point of view, its beauty is its simplicity. So the fact that really we have one mission, which is to spread Christmas joy, to
Yeah.
send Christmas gifts to young people who will be in hospital over Christmas. So young people who are struggling with their mental health will be dealing with conditions including bipolar disorder, ADHD, schizophrenia, depression. So yeah, I mean we can list all the conditions, but people, children and young people who are in hospital over Christmas.
And
And
I
yeah,
want this distinction, if you don't mind. So we know if somebody is in one of the children's hospitals because they've got a life-threatening condition such as cancer or they've had an accident, we know that the whole world will give them love and compassion. We also
mm,
know that if you, as we have discussed all the way through this show, if you're on a psych ward as a child, you have media misrepresentation. You're turned into a target. You're turned into a political football so that people can play games and get clicks. And that's the truth and reality. And why is it important that we have a charity like Christmas that comes in that context, which will say to children in that context, we love you.
yeah, I think it's really basic, isn't it, in terms of just the equality, whether you actually have any knowledge around mental health or not, just the equality that, yeah, any child or young person in hospital over Christmas
Yeah.
should be cared about, should be thought about, should be loved. The charity's founding story is that a brilliant doctor called Roy Bevan, she'd spent one Christmas on a ward in hospital that was treating children who had physical illnesses. And she saw the love that we're talking about, the visits from Father Christmas, the presents that came in, the celebrations. And there were actually so many presents coming in that they had enough to save over for children's birthdays until summer. So there was so much coming in, which is fantastic, and
Right.
as it should be. But
Absolutely.
then the next Christmas, she was working on a CAMHS ward, so children who were struggling with mental illness, and there was absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
So they were just about able to scrape together a few presents, but that was from their very, very meagre NHS budgets to make sure that young people maybe got one present each. And what I love about it is we were talking about anger earlier. She was just so angry that
Oh,
that sort of that experience and that inequality that she then used that anger to write a social media post on Facebook where she sort of got it all out there and said, you know, look, this isn't right. We need to have equality for children and young people on all wards. And from that anger, that's where this charity was born, basically wanting to have Christmas for everybody, Christmas for all children, all young people, doesn't matter what they're going through. And then over the years, it's the charity's just grown and grown to be able to now send out presents and decorations and advent calendars to every single
I know. It's the
family
extraordinary
in the
growth to every
UK.
single. Charlie, I want to give you the last word. Tell me about Christmas camps, why you're thinking of maybe getting involved. You might be involved, you might not. What's in, is it important, this thing?
Yeah, so I've been donating for years. And then this year have like really gotten more involved. I've been creating content and I went down for the packing weekend. So I did a session of the packing last week. Me and my mum went from Birmingham to Bath to help them do the packing. Because yeah, I think it's really something I want to put my energy into. It's really something that I wholeheartedly believe in. I spent that Christmas on a ward, no decorations even. Like concept of like presents and stuff when I learned about the charity was wild to me because that just wasn't my experience. I had a few hours off the ward on Christmas Day. Like I'd been allowed a few hours, but it was the first time I'd been home since I was admitted, so it was just too chaotic for me to be able to process. So I ended up back on the ward early afternoon, and like even their concept of like a Christmas dinner for those who had like ended up staying on the ward on the day was horrendous, like, So like I think for me, the difference that it could have made is so huge. Like just to know, I think people need to understand that it's not just about the gift itself. It's not the physical item for a lot of people. It's about, seeing the care that people have and that you are still very much valued and still a part of society and all of that connotation is actually arguably more important than
Yes.
like the physical gift. And I think what that could have done for me, just to feel that at that time would have been like such an important boost. And I think that's why, yeah, I think that it's so important.
Well, it is a simple act with huge metaphor attached.
Yeah.
It really is. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. We have to finish now, I'm afraid. I think we need to have another show and talk about some of these larger issues as well. But this year, I wanted to make sure we get the message out to people that, the spirit of Christmas is to share one's heart with others. It's not complicated, and we don't need to overcomplicate it, really. We need to just share our hearts a bit more. I want to thank you both for coming on, the courage that you've had in being here, sort of getting on with it, getting over these experiences, learning to manage complicated conditions, the courage you have in sharing those experiences and daring to get well. That takes a lot of effort, a lot of courage, and I really appreciate that. And the fact that you're willing to advocate for kids that need somebody to advocate for them. They really do, these vulnerable children on these wards over Christmas. And the fact that you've been packing boxes of presents is amazing. That's great. And all the kids that are going to receive those presents. We need to finish for now. So you stay there. I'm going to say thanks to everybody who's tuned in. If it's brought up uncomfortable issues because of personal experiences, make sure you talk to people about it. Make sure you reach out if you've got sort of healthcare or social care professionals, have a chat with them, with family, with friends. There are lots of groups out there that can help. Charli's sort of advocacy about some of the social media stuff. There are groups there, but be buyer beware with some of that social media stuff. But there are some really healthy, strong groups, organizations like Together All, etc., etc. So make sure you take care of yourself. The last thing you should ever do is sit in silence with this stuff and feel like you're alone. You're not, ever. That's just a feeling. And I want to thank you both for being on. We're going to say goodbye for now. I want to wish everybody a wonderful, heartwarming Christmas. And wherever you are, if you're in a difficult circumstance, know that you are loved and cared for. And the more we have those voices out there, the better. So lots of love to you all. Merry Christmas, and I'll see you all in the new year. So bye bye for now.